If knowledge fragments, it does not disappear. It reorganizes. And within the framework described in the Secret Teachings of All Ages, one of the most enduring forms that reorganization takes is what we now call the gods. Not as simple characters. Not as primitive explanations for weather, death, fertility, fear, or power. Not as decorative figures placed inside old stories because ancient people lacked better language, but as structures, as symbolic containers, as archetypes of power that carry meaning after the larger system that created them has broken apart. Because once a unified system collapses, knowledge cannot remain in the same form. It cannot stay completely organized. It cannot remain fully visible. It cannot depend on the same institutions, the same schools, the same temples, or the same initiatory structures to preserve it. So it changes shape. It becomes portable. It becomes memorable. It becomes symbolic. And this is where the gods begin to emerge as something far more complex than mythology alone. They become vessels, forms capable of carrying fragments of a larger structure across time. A god can survive when a school disappears. A god can survive when a temple collapses. A god can survive when a language changes, when a civilization falls, when a priesthood is broken, when the original structure of meaning is no longer available. Because a god is not only a name. A god is an arrangement of symbols. A god is a pattern of attributes. A god is a relationship between forces. And this is why the gods move so easily across cultures. Their names change. Their images change. Their stories change. But the function remains. The Sky Father. The Solar Ruler. The Underworld Lord. The Mother of Forms. The Divine Child. The Trickster. The Judge. The Warrior. The Messenger. The Revealer. The Destroyer. The one who descends. The one who returns. The one who stands between worlds. These figures appear again and again because they are not random inventions. They represent recurring structures, patterns that human beings encounter externally in nature, politically in society, spiritually in symbol, and internally within the self. This is why the ancient gods cannot be reduced to superstition without losing the entire system behind them. A superficial reading sees many gods and assumes many beliefs, but a symbolic reading sees functions. It sees the division of power into recognizable forms. It sees the attempt to organize invisible principles into visible images. And this is the key. The gods make the invisible visible. They give shape to forces that cannot easily be described directly. The sun is not just the sun. It becomes a symbol of radiance, order, vitality, kingship, illumination, and consciousness. The underworld is not just a place beneath the earth. It becomes a symbol of descent, death, hidden knowledge, transformation, judgment, and return. The mother is not just a biological figure. She becomes matter, nature, fertility, containment, origin, nourishment, and form. The messenger is not just someone who travels. He becomes communication, transition, translation, intelligence, movement between realms, and the crossing of boundaries. This is how the gods function. They gather many related meanings into one image. They compress complexity into form. And because the form can be remembered, the complexity can survive. This is essential after collapse, because when knowledge is no longer preserved as a complete system, it must survive through forms that can carry more than one meaning at once. The gods do exactly that. They hold layers. They allow a single figure to contain cosmology, psychology, ritual, ethics, power, nature, and metaphysics all at the same time. This is why ancient deities often feel larger than the stories attached to them. The stories are only one layer. The deity itself is the structure behind the story. And once you understand that, mythology begins to change. It stops looking like a collection of tales. It starts looking like a symbolic architecture, a way of organizing reality through figures that can be remembered, worshipped, feared, invoked, studied, painted, carved, sung, and passed forward. This also explains why gods are rarely simple. They contradict themselves. They shift mood. They appear merciful in one story and terrifying in another. They create and destroy. They protect and punish. They reveal and conceal. To a modern mind, this can seem inconsistent, but symbolically, it is precise. Because real forces are not simple. Power is not simple. Nature is not simple. The mind is not simple. Transformation is not simple. A god that represents a true archetypal force must contain contradiction, because the force itself contains contradiction. The sun gives life, but it also burns. The sea nourishes, but it also devours. The underworld terrifies, but it also transforms. The mother creates, but she also consumes. The king protects order, but order can become tyranny. The trickster disrupts stability, but disruption can open the way to change. This is why the gods are not moral in a simple modern sense. They are not neat examples of good and evil. They are expressions of power. And power is dangerous when misunderstood. That danger is part of their meaning. The ancient gods were not designed to make reality comfortable. They were designed to make reality intelligible, not by flattening it, but by giving it form. This is why the gods often stand at the intersection between the human and the cosmic. They are larger than people, but not completely separate from people. They are cosmic principles shown in human shape. They speak, desire, rage, love, deceive, create, destroy, suffer, and triumph. But beneath those human qualities, something larger is being carried. The human form makes the principle approachable. The divine scale reminds us that it is not merely personal. This is the function of archetype. It allows the individual to encounter something vast through an image that can be held in the mind. A pure cosmic principle is too abstract. A god gives it a face. A story gives it movement. A ritual gives it presence. A symbol gives it continuity. And together, these allow the structure to survive. This is why similar divine figures appear across cultures that may seem unrelated on the surface. The Egyptian Thoth, the Greek Hermes, and the Roman Mercury are not identical, but they occupy a recognizable field of meaning. Writing, speech, measurement, transmission, boundary crossing, intelligence, translation between worlds. The surface changes. The function persists. The same is true of solar figures, underworld figures, divine mothers, storm gods, dying and returning gods, and sacred kings. Each culture expresses the archetype through its own language, landscape, politics, and spiritual imagination. But the underlying structure remains visible. This is not about flattening all cultures into one vague system. That would be lazy. The differences matter, but the repetitions matter too. And it is in the tension between difference and repetition that the deeper structure begins to show itself. Because if the same patterns continue to appear, the question becomes why? Why does power so often take the form of a sky ruler? Why does transformation so often require descent? Why does wisdom so often come from a boundary-crossing figure? Why does creation so often emerge from darkness, water, chaos, or the void? Why does divine knowledge so often need to be stolen, revealed, concealed, or earned? These are not just storytelling habits. They are symbolic memories. They point to the way human consciousness organizes experience. And within the esoteric framework, they also point to the remnants of a much older structure. A structure in which gods were not merely worshipped, but understood as keys. Keys to forces. Keys to processes. Keys to relationships between the visible and the invisible. This is why the gods are so often linked with planets, elements, numbers, animals, colors, metals, body parts, virtues, vices, and sacred directions. They are not isolated personalities. They are nodes in a system. Each god gathers correspondences. Each correspondence expands the field of meaning. A deity becomes a center point where multiple symbolic languages meet. Astronomy meets psychology. Nature meets ritual. Power meets morality. The body meets the cosmos. The visible world meets the invisible order beneath it. And this is exactly why the gods are so useful as carriers of fragmented knowledge. A single divine figure can preserve an entire network. Even if the full system is lost, the figure remains. Even if the correspondences are later misunderstood, traces remain. Even if the rituals change, the symbolic pattern continues. This is how memory survives collapse. Not as a complete document, not as a clean doctrine, but as a living symbolic form. This also explains why later traditions often reinterpreted earlier gods instead of simply erasing them. A god could become a saint. A goddess could become a symbol of virtue, temptation, wisdom, or nature. A planetary deity could become an astrological force. A mythic figure could become a moral lesson. A local spirit could be absorbed into a larger religious system. The name changes. The frame changes. But the pattern continues moving. Sometimes clearly, sometimes in disguise, sometimes reduced, sometimes elevated, but still present. This is the strange durability of the gods. They are difficult to kill because they do not depend on one form. They can migrate. They can be renamed. They can be hidden inside new systems. They can become symbols, allegories, demons, angels, saints, planets, virtues, psychological types, or literary figures. The archetype survives because it is deeper than the costume. And this is where the modern world often misunderstands ancient religion. It assumes that when belief changes, the old gods vanish. But symbolically, that is not what happens. The old forms may lose public authority. Their temples may fall. Their rituals may stop. Their priesthoods may disappear. But the archetypal structures they carried continue to appear. In art, in politics, in celebrity, in branding, in national myths, in cinema, in the way power is staged, in the way leaders are presented, in the way rebellion is romanticized, in the way beauty is worshipped, in the way destruction is feared and desired. The gods do not disappear. They return through whatever symbolic language a culture still understands. This is not a claim that Zeus or Isis or Hermes are secretly being worshipped every time a modern image resembles them. That would be too crude. The point is subtler. The structures they represented continue to operate because the human relationship to power, fear, transformation, desire, order, chaos, death, and meaning has not disappeared. We have changed the language. We have not removed the pattern. And this is why studying the ancient gods still matters inside this series. Not because we are trying to revive old worship, not because we are trying to prove literal beings, but because the gods show how knowledge survives by becoming image, how power becomes symbol, how fragments of a lost structure can continue to speak through forms that outlive the civilization that first shaped them. This brings us back to Atlantis. If Atlantis represents coherence and its fall represents fragmentation, then the gods represent one of the first major forms of preservation after that fragmentation. They are what happens when structure can no longer remain whole, but still needs to be remembered. The gods carry the pieces. They hold the forces in recognizable form. They allow later cultures to engage with fragments of the old system without needing full access to the original. But this also means the gods require interpretation. They cannot be read only on the surface. Their stories must be examined for structure. Their attributes must be seen as symbolic clusters. Their contradictions must be understood as part of their function. And their repetition across cultures must be treated as meaningful, not accidental. Because once we approach them this way, the ancient gods stop being relics of the past. They become maps. Maps of power. Maps of consciousness. Maps of the way human beings have attempted to understand the forces moving through the world and through themselves. And this is where the next stage begins. Because gods do not move through history alone. They are carried by stories. Their power is preserved through narrative. Their meaning survives through repetition. And when those stories are repeated long enough, across enough time, they become something more than fiction. They become memory. Encoded memory. A way of preserving history, structure, and symbolic truth inside forms that can survive collapse. So the question is no longer simply what the gods represent. The question becomes how those representations are carried, how a fragment becomes a story, how a story becomes a tradition, and how a tradition becomes a memory of something older than itself. Because once the gods become narrative, myth begins.